Hey guys, so I'd like to share with you a slightly unusual game today because I'm playing against the computer, but this is not just any computer. I thought I'd check out the Beth Harmon characters off chess.com. This is obviously inspired by the Netflix show The Queen's Gambit, and you can play against Beth at different ages. So I think it starts off with Beth aged 8, rated about 800 or something like that, but I thought I'd have a go against Beth aged 10, and this one's supposed to be rated about 1600, so let me take you through the game because it's a good one. So I start with e4, and Beth responds c5, so we've got the Sicilian opening. And what I've been doing recently is going for the Grand Prix Attack, which comes from the closed Sicilian. That's for your second move, knight to c3. Beth plays d6, and now the Grand Prix Attack is typified by f4. So creating space now for my knight to come to f3, but behind the advanced pawn. Beth plays g6, preparing to fianchetto the dark squared bishop, I would imagine, and now knight to f3. Dark square bishop fianchettos to g7, and now I play bishop to e2. The bishop can also come to c4, it can come to b5, there are many options. Knight to c6 is played, and then d3, so I'm just shoring up my light squared pawn structure here. This does create a pocket where the knight can jump into, but that's not my concern. My intention here is to castle quickly, get my queen to e1, and hopefully start a kingside attack. Okay, Harmon plays bishop to g4, attacking my knight. I go ahead and castle anyway because I figure that if the bishop takes my knight, I can always recapture with the rook. Then that gives me the option of swinging the rook across to g3 or h3 as part of my attack. Captures the knight on c3, that's okay, I recapture with the b pawn, and now the queen comes to b6, which doesn't cause me too much concern. One move I spot here is maybe c4 would really close off that side of the board. I don't play that, I play bishop to e3, which pins this pawn, so this pawn now can't move forwards because the queen would be lost. And Beth captures my other knight now, so she's left with two knights on the board, I'm left with two bishops, which means that as the board opens up, it will favour me. So she wants to avoid trading pawns at this stage. Okay, but she plays e5 anyway, offering up a pawn, and I play f5, which is quite common in the Grand Prix. Beth declines a pawn exchange and moves the queen back. I capture. So now you can see that this pawn structure of hers is starting to look a little bit like it's got some bullet holes in it. Captures back with the h-pawn, and now I play bishop to g4. I think the bishop here on f3 is, yes, it's guarding, helping to protect the g2 pawn, but it doesn't have much scope in the game, at least here. Then it's covering off some vital squares that the king or the queen might like to move to. f5 is played, I capture, and now the queen comes in to h3. Clearly the threat is queen takes h2, which would force the king to flee to f2. The bishop isn't under threat right now because the queen's defending it, but I spot a tactic that will help me to protect both the bishop and my king's side, and then my king's security there, which is to block the queen's advance with bishop to h3. I've actually got now two pieces also looking at this pawn, so that if g captures the f pawn, I can always recapture with a rook if I want to. That's actually what happens, but I don't recapture straight away. I decide instead to kick the queen with my bishop, so bishop back to there, and now queen to f3. Defends with the knight, rook f to e1, lining itself up with the king. Okay, so still at this point in time, material is absolutely equal on the board, My king is looking a lot safer, however. Pawn is pushed to c4. Now, a capture on d3 would suit me down to the ground because I can recapture with my c2 pawn, and that would undouble my pawns that are currently doubled. The same thing would happen, of course, if I push here, captures, maybe c2 to c3, and the same kind of deal. Beth doesn't capture on d4, so I initiate the exchange. Recaptures with the knight, that's okay, but what this does is, of course, leaves a pawn on pre. So I decide a pawn is a pawn, and I go in and capture with my queen on b7. Now, this also comes with the threat against this rook. Beth can't allow me to capture that rook because it would come with check. The king would have to move because the only other move is to block with the knight, and I just grab that, so the king would have to move, and that would cause problems. So Beth castles, I bring my bishop, I improve my bishop basically. So this is doing a couple of things. It's now partnered with this pawn, and this is a common endgame kind of motif. If you can anchor one of your bishops to a pawn of the same colour in this way, the bishop's defending the pawn is defending the bishop, and for example a piece like a king can do nothing about that structure. It's there for forever, a lot of the time. The other thing, of course, is that this bishop is now looking down at the king's side, so black needs to move pretty carefully now. So I'm one pawn up at this point in time. Beth moves the queen there. Obviously, one tactic, whenever you see high value pieces lined up along on the same rank or the same file, then you need to be thinking about attacks primarily with the rook, because obviously a queen threat there is not the same because he can just exchange queens, or she can. So one idea could be rook to e3, rook to g3, pinning the queen and winning the queen. So I don't go for that in this instance. I move my rook e to f1. Rook comes across to kick the queen away. Queen just sidesteps. Rook comes across again. And now I come in with a second attacker. If you look at this potential exchange here, we've got bishop takes knight, and if pawn takes knight, that then makes this queen, means that this queen is also looking at e5. So bishop takes, pawn takes, and potentially I've then got queen takes as an idea. So Beth moves the rook a to b8, and I initiate the exchange with the bishop, pawn takes, and now queen takes. Okay, so now because of that I've now won a second pawn. So I'm 2 pawns up, and 2 pawns up can be enough to win a game. So what I need to be doing now is I need to be thinking about simplifying, exchanging pieces off, and to try and convert my 2 pawn advantage. If you imagine that all these rest of these pieces aren't really on the board and we're down to kings, we've got pawns, black's pawns here, and white's pawns here. So I've got these kind of 2 pawns extra on the G and H file, and these pawns on the queen side are kind of blocked off. My pawns are doubled, so that doesn't really count as an extra. But a king with 2 pawns against a king with 1 pawn looks like a pretty good match. And then if I can come across and maybe capture the c pawn, then that would be great. So Beth accepts the queen exchange, which I'm happy about. I now notice also that I've got 3 pieces looking at f5. So king moves in, I grab that, and the knight captures. So I've got 2 choices now. I can capture with the rook on f, which would be check, obviously, both would, or I can capture with the rook on e. So do I want my rooks lined up along the same file, or do I want them lined up on the 5th rank? So I decide that I'm happy and slightly more comfortable having my my rook here protecting my king and protecting the back rank, so I decided to capture with the e rook. And now what I do is very, very classic kind of an endgame pattern. I'm going to shuffle the king across the board. Okay, so rook f2 e1, king moves across. Rook f2 d5, the king is forced to move across again, And now, very simply, rook to c5 with a fork. So this is a rook fork. So I'm attacking both the king and the pawn. The king cannot get around this rook to defend the pawn, so the pawn is likely to be lost. King moves to b6, I capture the pawn. I'm now 4 pawns up at this point. King comes in to harass the rook. Rook simply moves across. If my opponent accepts the exchange here, that's great for me. I undouble my pawns, I'm 4 pawns in front. Beth does that, which I think was an error. And now the king comes in to attack the pawn. I don't try and defend the pawn with the rook, but she comes in, rook to b2. I defend my d pawn with the c pawn, captures, and now it's really a foot race. I have 4 pawns on the board. Beth has only the single one. Can she convert this pawn, which is 4 steps away from promotion? But of course, remember the rook's in the way, so that's at least 1 more move to get the rook out. Okay, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 steps to promotion, so we're actually kind of equal. The question is, can I interrupt or disturb Beth's path to promotion before she can disturb mine? So rook comes across to c2. I put my king in safety, rook comes across again, and now I start running. And she runs, and I run, and she runs. And now I drop my rook back to e1. So now if, for example, pawn goes there, my intention is to drop my rook behind the pawn. Now in some instances, putting the rook here can be winning, but that pawn would be unprotected, so I just grab the pawn. So Beth pushes the rook up to attack and prevent my pawn's advance, so I push my g-pawn. This is the benefit of having pawns on adjacent files where they can support each other. She pushes a2, I play rook to a1, and now it's just a case of my king coming in to shepherd these pawns to safety. Rook goes up, and you can see I'm just shuffling the pawns up with my king. And now this is a losing position because I have this extra pawn on the g-file. Rook comes across, I capture the pawn because I figure now that Beth's only real chance of winning this game is to convert this pawn. Okay, so I figure if I take the pawn and she recaptures, I've then got the opportunity to promote my h pawn, which also comes with check. Okay. So black has to move, and now with such an open board and the only queen on the board, I can pretty much guarantee that I can keep black in check until I either can remove this rook, say with a skewer, or I can promote my other pawn. Okay, so Beth plays king to c3, check, and now here's the skewer. Okay, I could have done it. I could have played king to f7 or king to e6 with a skewer on the queen there. Skewer on the king. King would have to move, and then I just grab the rook and easily convert my remaining pawn. But I figure, what's the rush? I'm in no danger whatsoever here. And then it's a basic king and queen ending. So what my queen's doing now is it's partitioning the board and corralling the king into an ever smaller square or rectangle. Remember, the king cannot approach the queen, right? So the queen, imagine the queen has a force field all the way around it, okay? So the king cannot enter that. So I'm just moving my king in now, always making sure that the black king has at least 1 escape square unless it's in check. King goes into the corner. Now I can't do this. I can't play king to b3 because that would mean stalemate. Okay, so I have to be very careful. Queen to c3 check leaves 2 options. She plays king to b1. Now I can play another check, king to a2, bring my king in. So treading very carefully and always making sure the king's got at least 1 square. And now the king is forced to a2, and then with queen to b3, the king's now forced to a1, queen to b2, checkmate, and that's how you beat the Beth Bot 1600. Beth Harmon, fictional character, age 10, but a very satisfying game. So really, the story of that game was that I played in a solid way. I gained a couple of pawns of advantage, and then simply continued to play solidly, exchange pieces, simplify, and then go on to a very, very standard endgame. So I hope you've enjoyed that. See you next time.